They called it military necessity. History still argues with that choice. In the frozen mud of Stalingrad's outskirts in January 1943, a Soviet captain gave Private Ivan Petrov an order that followed every rule of war, and it destroyed something inside him that Doctrine could never rebuild. The order was simple. Leave the German medic to die, hold your position, and protect 8 Soviet wounded men lying exposed in the snow behind you. It was the correct tactical decision. It was the humane choice for your own people. And when Petrov disobeyed 12 seconds before an SS execution squad arrived, it began a cascade of consequences that would strip him of everything except the question that haunted him for the rest of his life. January 1943 marked one of the coldest winters the Eastern Front had ever seen. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees below zero, and the ground became a sheet of iron beneath thin layers of snow that crunched under every movement. Private Ivan Petrov, 24 years old, lay in a shallow depression carved into frozen earth outside a shattered village whose name had been burned off every map by artillery fire. He was a scout sniper attached to the 62nd Army, one of the formations grinding through the final stages of what would become the Stalingrad counteroffensive. His Mosin-Nagant rifle rested against packed snow, the metal so cold it burned skin on contact, and his breath came in careful, shallow pulls that he timed to avoid creating visible vapor clouds. 300 meters ahead, across a field of corpses and shattered equipment, a German medic dragged himself toward the remnants of a stone wall, trailing blood across white snow in a line so vivid it looked painted. Petrov had been watching the medic for 11 minutes. The man wore the Red Cross armband clearly visible even at this distance, and he moved with the desperate mechanical determination of someone who knew death was close but refused to accept it. His left leg was shattered, probably from shrapnel, and every meter of progress cost him visible agony. Petrov's orders were explicit. His captain, a veteran named Sokolov, who had survived 2 years of this war through ruthless calculation, had positioned Petrov here for one reason: to cover the withdrawal of 8 wounded Soviet soldiers who were being moved to the rear through exposed terrain. The captain's logic was flawless. If Petrov moved to help the German, he would expose his position to counter-snipers who were certainly watching that medic as bait. If counter-snipers opened fire, the 8 Soviet wounded would be trapped in the open with no covering fire. Military doctrine, the survival of your own men, and basic tactical sense all pointed to the same decision: let the German die and hold your position. But Petrov could see the man's face. At this distance, through his scope, he could see the exhaustion and the fear and the strange, quiet determination that came from choosing to keep crawling when crawling made no rational sense. He could see the medic's hands, bare and turning blue, clawing at frozen ground. And behind Petrov, 12 seconds away by his internal clock, he could hear the sound that changed everything: the deliberate, measured crunch of boots on snow. Not the chaotic noise of a regular infantry patrol. Not the scattered movement of soldiers under fire. This was the sound of an execution detail moving with purpose. The SS Einsatzgruppen had been operating in this sector for 3 weeks, and their method was always the same. They advanced slowly, rifles ready, and they shot wounded men where they lay. No prisoners. No hesitation. Just cold efficiency that followed its own terrible logic. Petrov had 8 Soviet comrades behind him and 1 German medic ahead of him. His orders were clear. His duty was defined. And in the 11 seconds he had left before the SS squad entered effective range, he made a choice that would follow him into a prison cell and haunt him for 5 years of labor camp darkness. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this decision would become a story whispered in guilt and anger by men who survived and men who didn't. The question was never whether the German deserved to live. The question was whether saving 1 enemy life was worth risking 8 of your own. And Petrov, in that frozen moment with death approaching from 2 directions, decided that some choices destroy you no matter which way you turn. Ivan Petrov had never intended to become a sniper. He was a farmhand from a village outside Kursk, a place so small it didn't appear on military maps, where life revolved around planting seasons and harvest rhythms that hadn't changed in 200 years. His father raised cattle and grew wheat on land that had belonged to the family since before the revolution, and Ivan had expected to do the same until the day he died. He was not particularly patriotic, not especially brave, and not someone who thought much about ideology or politics. He went to school until he was 14, learned to read well enough to handle farm records, and spent his evenings helping his father repair equipment and care for livestock. His world was measured in kilometers. He could walk before dark, and the idea that he would one day lie in frozen mud making decisions about life and death would have seemed absurd to the young man who left that farm in October 1941. The Red Army took him 3 months after the German invasion began. He was 22 years old, strong from years of physical labor, and he passed the basic medical examination without difficulty. They gave him 6 weeks of training at a camp near Moscow, where the instructors were exhausted veterans pulled from the front lines to teach terrified conscripts how to load rifles and dig trenches. Ivan learned to march, to follow orders, and to clean the Mosin-Nagant rifle that would become the only constant companion in his life. He was not a natural soldier. He struggled with military discipline and formal hierarchy, and he received 3 reprimands in his first month for failing to salute officers correctly. But he had one skill that the Army valued more than parade ground precision. He could shoot. On the farm, he had spent years hunting wolves and foxes that threatened livestock, and he had developed the patient, methodical approach of someone who understood that one clean shot saved hours of tracking wounded animals through forest darkness. When the training camp ran marksmanship tests, Ivan scored in the top 5% of his entire battalion, and an instructor named Volkov pulled him aside after the 3rd day of testing. Volkov was a grizzled sergeant who had survived the purges of 1937 and the opening disasters of Barbarossa, and he had the permanently exhausted expression of someone who had stopped believing in survival and now operated purely on professional habit. He told Ivan that the Army needed snipers, men who could kill German officers and machine gunners from distances that kept them safe from immediate retaliation. It was not a glamorous assignment. It was lonely, cold work that required spending hours motionless in positions where discovery meant death, and it attracted men who could tolerate isolation better than camaraderie. Ivan accepted not because he wanted glory or revenge, but because sniper work meant operating in small teams away from the mass infantry formations that were being slaughtered in suicidal frontal assaults. It was a calculation of survival, not heroism, and Volkov recognized this immediately. He trained Ivan for 3 weeks in advanced marksmanship, camouflage, and fieldcraft, and then sent him to the 62nd Army as part of a sniper section attached to a rifle division fighting outside Stalingrad. That was where Ivan met Captain Sokolov. Sokolov commanded a reconnaissance company that operated ahead of main infantry lines, identifying German positions and calling in artillery strikes on targets of opportunity. He was 36 years old, a career officer who had fought in the Finnish War and understood that modern warfare was not about courage or ideology, but about mathematics and resource management. He treated his men as assets to be deployed efficiently, not as individuals with hopes or fears, and he made tactical decisions with the cold precision of someone calculating acceptable losses. When Ivan arrived in November 1942, Sokolov gave him one piece of advice that defined their entire relationship. Your job is to kill Germans efficiently and stay alive long enough to kill more Germans tomorrow. Everything else, politics, morality, personal feelings, was a distraction that got soldiers killed. Ivan respected this brutal clarity even when he didn't agree with it, and for 2 months he operated exactly as Sokolov demanded, taking carefully selected shots at German officers and communication personnel while avoiding unnecessary risks. The relationship worked because both men understood the same fundamental truth. This war was not about individual heroism, but about collective survival. Sokolov protected his snipers by positioning them carefully and extracting them before enemy counter-snipers could locate them. Ivan fulfilled his mission by remaining disciplined and patient, never taking shots that weren't worth the exposure, never risking the position for targets that didn't matter. They developed a mutual trust built on professional competence rather than personal connection, and that trust was absolute until the morning when Ivan watched a German medic crawling through snow and heard the sound of SS boots approaching from behind. In that moment, everything Sokolov had taught him about efficiency and acceptable losses collided with something older and deeper that Ivan couldn't name but couldn't ignore. He was about to break the one rule that mattered. He was about to put one enemy life above the mission, above his orders, and above the 8 Soviet wounded men whose survival depended on him holding his position. The first man Ivan Petrov killed was a German lieutenant standing beside a disabled half-track on a frozen road outside Stalingrad. It happened on December 8, 1942, 3 days after Ivan arrived at the front, and he remembered every detail with a clarity that only guilt and necessity can create. The lieutenant was smoking a cigarette and gesturing at a map while 2 enlisted men worked on the half-track's engine, completely unaware that they were being watched from 400 meters away through a sniper scope. Captain Sokolov had positioned Ivan in the ruins of a grain elevator with clear sightlines to the road, and his orders were precise. Kill the officer, leave the enlisted men alone because officers were harder to replace, and withdraw immediately before German counter-snipers could triangulate his position. Ivan spent 11 minutes watching the lieutenant through his scope, studying the man's face and movements, and he noticed details that had nothing to do with the mission. The lieutenant was young, probably 25, and he smiled when one of the enlisted men made a joke Ivan couldn't hear. He wore his uniform carefully, and his gestures had the relaxed confidence of someone who believed he would survive this war. When Ivan finally took the shot, the lieutenant dropped without sound, and the 2 enlisted men scattered in panic, while Ivan packed his rifle and withdrew through the elevator's back entrance exactly as Sokolov had instructed. That night, Ivan couldn't sleep. He lay in a dugout wrapped in a thin blanket while other soldiers snored around him, and he replayed the moment endlessly in his mind. Not the shot itself, which had been clean and professional, but the 11 minutes of watching beforehand. He kept seeing the lieutenant smile and the casual way he had gestured at the map, and he wondered what the man had been planning, whether he had family waiting in Germany, whether his death would be reported as a combat casualty or simply recorded as another number in the endless accounting of war. Ivan had hunted animals his entire life, and he had always felt a brief moment of regret when a clean shot dropped a wolf or fox, a recognition that something living had become something dead. But this was different. This was a man who had thoughts and memories and people who cared whether he lived or died. And Ivan had erased all of that with one pull of a trigger from a distance that made it feel almost abstract. Sokolov found him the next morning staring at nothing, and the captain sat down beside him without speaking for several minutes. Then Sokolov said something that Ivan never forgot. You did exactly what you were supposed to do, and if you hadn't done it, that lieutenant would have sent men to kill your comrades, and then more people would be dead instead of just him. Sokolov explained that war was not about individual deaths, but about mathematical outcomes, and the only morality that mattered was keeping your own people alive while making the enemy pay the highest possible cost for every meter of ground. Ivan understood the logic even though it didn't make him feel better, and over the next 6 weeks he killed 11 more Germans while learning to suppress the part of himself that wanted to think about who they were. The 8 Soviet wounded men who lay behind Ivan's position on that January morning were not strangers. He knew 6 of them by name, and he had shared dugouts and rations with 4 of them during the grinding winter fighting. There was Dmitri, a machine gunner from Leningrad who talked constantly about his wife and 2 daughters, and who had been hit by shrapnel during an artillery barrage 3 days earlier. There was Alexei, a 19-year-old radio operator who had frozen feet and couldn't walk without assistance, and who still joked about the German broadcast he had intercepted where a Wehrmacht officer complained about the quality of replacement boots. There was Yuri, a veteran sergeant who had survived since 1941 and had taken a rifle round through his shoulder while covering the withdrawal of his squad from a failed assault. These were men Ivan had lived beside, men who had shared their last cigarettes and covered his position when German patrols came too close, men whose survival mattered not because of tactical necessity, but because they were the closest thing to family he had in this frozen hell. Captain Sokolov had positioned Ivan to protect them because Ivan was the best shot in the company, and because the route they needed to traverse had no cover from German observation points. If Ivan held his position and maintained overwatch, the wounded could be evacuated safely. If Ivan abandoned his position, they would be exposed to enemy fire with no protection. But Ivan could also see the German medic crawling toward that stone wall, and something in him refused to accept the mathematics of acceptable losses. The medic was unarmed, clearly wounded, and operating under the protections of the Geneva Convention that theoretically governed warfare, even in this savage theater. More than that, the medic was trying to live with the same desperate determination Ivan had seen in Dmitri and Alexei and Yuri. The crawling man was not a tactical asset or an acceptable loss or a mathematical variable in someone's calculation of efficiency. He was a human being choosing to keep moving when stopping meant death, and Ivan understood that choice in a way that transcended nationality or ideology. The SS execution squad was 10 seconds away now, their boots crunching steadily closer through the snow, and Ivan had to make a decision that followed either his orders or his conscience. He could not follow both. What Captain Sokolov had taught him was absolutely correct from a military perspective, and what Ivan was about to do would violate every tactical principle and betray every trust that had been placed in him. But in that frozen moment, with death approaching from two directions and 8 Soviet lives depending on his discipline, Ivan Petrov decided that some choices had to be made by men, not by doctrine. Ivan Petrov had 7 seconds left to make his decision, and in those 7 seconds the entire world compressed into 3 sounds. The German medics labored breathing 200 meters ahead, the crunch of SS boots 6 meters behind him, and the wind carrying voices from the 8 Soviet wounded men who were supposed to be evacuating in silence, but couldn't suppress their pain. He could hear Dmitri groaning as someone dragged him across frozen ground, and he could hear the radio operator, Alexei, whispering prayers in a voice that cracked with fear and cold. These were the sounds of men who trusted that Ivan would hold his position and protect them, men who believed the sniper covering their withdrawal would follow his orders, because orders were the only thing keeping anyone alive in this chaos. But Ivan was not following his orders anymore. His hands were already moving, releasing the rifle from its position and checking the safety on his sidearm, and his mind was calculating distances and angles in a way that had nothing to do with tactical efficiency and everything to do with a choice he couldn't explain even to himself. The SS execution squad was operating with a methodical precision that made them so effective at their terrible work. Ivan had studied their patterns during 3 weeks of operating in this sector, and he understood exactly how they functioned. They moved in groups of 4 or 5 men, rifles ready, spacing themselves to avoid concentrated fire, and they advanced with the absolute confidence of soldiers who knew that wounded men couldn't fight back. Their doctrine was simple and brutal. Soviet wounded represented a drain on enemy medical resources and a potential source of intelligence if captured. So the most efficient solution was to eliminate them where they lay. No interrogation, no prisoners, no hesitation. Just clean execution that followed a logic Ivan understood even as he despised it. The squad leader was 30 meters behind Ivan's position now, moving slowly because the terrain was broken and visibility was poor in the blowing snow. He couldn't see Ivan yet, but he would see him the moment Ivan moved from his concealed position, and the SS were trained to shoot anything that moved without waiting for confirmation or identification. The German medic had stopped crawling. Ivan could see through his scope that the man had reached the stone wall and was trying to pull himself into cover, but his strength was failing and his movements had become weak and uncoordinated. Blood loss and hypothermia were shutting down his body with the mechanical inevitability of a machine running out of fuel, and Ivan estimated he had perhaps 3 or 4 minutes before the medic lost consciousness entirely. The Red Cross armband was clearly visible even in the poor light, and Ivan wondered whether the SS squad would honor the Geneva Convention protections or whether they would shoot the medic anyway as part of their standard clearing procedure. He suspected they would shoot. The SS operated under different rules than regular Wehrmacht units, and they had demonstrated repeatedly that their interpretation of military necessity included eliminating anyone who might slow their advance or complicate their logistics. Which meant that if Ivan did nothing, 2 men would die, the German medic from blood loss and exposure, and potentially one of the Soviet wounded if the SS squad detected the evacuation in progress. But if Ivan moved, if he abandoned his position to drag the German medic to safety, he would expose himself to both the SS squad and any German counter-snipers who might be watching this exact scenario unfold. Counter-sniper tactics on the Eastern Front had become sophisticated and deadly, and the Germans had learned to use wounded men as bait to draw out Soviet snipers who might break discipline to attempt rescue or finish kills. Ivan had to consider the possibility that this entire situation was a trap, that the German medic was deliberately placed here to provoke exactly the response Ivan was contemplating, and that the moment he moved from cover, a German marksman would put a round through his skull from a position he hadn't detected. It was a tactically sound assumption, the paranoid calculation that kept snipers alive, and Captain Sokolov would have immediately recognized it as the correct analysis. But Ivan looked at the crawling man and saw something that transcended tactical calculation. He saw exhaustion and determination and the fundamental human refusal to surrender to death. And he made a choice that followed older rules than military doctrine. Ivan moved. He broke from his position in a low crouch, rifle slung across his back, moving toward the German medic with the controlled speed of someone who had practiced movement under fire until it became instinct. The SS squad leader shouted something in German, and Ivan heard the metallic click of rifle bolts being worked as the execution detail reacted to movement they hadn't expected. Behind him, one of the Soviet wounded men screamed Ivan's name in anger and disbelief, and Ivan knew that scream would follow him into whatever came next. He had approximately 4 seconds before the SS opened fire, 4 seconds to reach the German medic and drag him to cover, 4 seconds to complete a rescue that violated every principle of military discipline and tactical sense. The German medic looked up as Ivan approached, and their eyes met across 3 meters of frozen ground. The German's expression showed confusion and terror and desperate hope, and Ivan realized in that instant that neither of them would survive this if the SS decided to shoot first and identify targets later. Ivan reached the German medic in 3.5 seconds. And in that brief span of time the world exploded into noise and chaos that he had trained himself to ignore, but could never fully escape. The SS squad opened fire not with the scattered panic of surprised soldiers, but with the disciplined volleys of men executing a tactical response they had practiced hundreds of times. Rifle rounds cracked overhead and impacted the frozen ground around Ivan's feet, throwing up small eruptions of ice and dirt that stung his face and hands. One round passed so close to his head that he felt the pressure wave against his left ear, and another struck the stone wall he was running toward with a sharp crack that sent fragments of masonry spinning through the air. The German medic had curled into a defensive position, arms wrapped around his head, and he was making a sound somewhere between sobbing and praying that Ivan recognized as the noise of a man who had accepted death, but couldn't stop his body from fighting for survival. Ivan didn't speak. He grabbed the German by his coat collar with both hands and pulled him toward the shelter of the wall with a kind of desperate strength that came from knowing you had one chance and no time for technique or gentleness. They made it behind the wall with perhaps half a second to spare before the SS concentrated their fire on the position. The wall was 3 feet thick, built from local stone during some forgotten century when this land had been prosperous enough to afford permanent construction, and it absorbed rifle rounds with dull impacts that shook dust from a mortar and sent chips of stone flying from the upper edge. Ivan pressed himself flat against the ground with the German medic beside him, both men breathing hard, and for several seconds neither of them moved or spoke. The German was staring at Ivan with an expression that mixed shock, gratitude, and complete incomprehension. His lips were moving, but no sound came out, and Ivan realized the man was probably in shock from blood loss and didn't fully understand what was happening. Ivan checked the German's wounds quickly, working with the efficient calm of someone who had seen enough battlefield injuries to know what mattered and what didn't. The leg wound was bad, shrapnel from an artillery burst that had torn through the calf muscle and probably fractured the bone, but it wasn't immediately fatal if they could stop the bleeding. The German had already applied a field dressing that was soaked through with blood, and Ivan used his own medical kit to add pressure bandages and a tourniquet that he tightened until the German gasped with pain. Behind them, back at Ivan's abandoned sniper position, the situation was deteriorating in exactly the way Captain Sokolov had predicted. The 8 Soviet wounded men were pinned down, unable to complete their evacuation because the SS squad had detected movement and shifted their attention from the German medic to the larger tactical opportunity. Ivan could hear Dmitri shouting orders, his voice hoarse with pain and anger, and he could hear return fire from the Soviet soldiers who were still mobile enough to fight. It was not heavy fire, not the concentrated volleys that might drive the SS back, but the scattered defensive shooting of men who were wounded and exhausted and fighting primarily to buy time for their comrades. The mathematics of the situation were brutal and clear. Ivan had abandoned his covering position to save 1 German medic, and that decision had directly led to 8 Soviet wounded men losing their protective overwatch at the exact moment an SS execution squad was advancing on their position. It was the outcome Sokolov had warned against, the consequence of letting individual conscience override tactical discipline, and Ivan knew with absolute certainty that men were going to die because of his choice. The SS squad leader was shouting commands in German, and Ivan understood enough of the language to recognize tactical instructions about flanking movements and fields of fire. They were not retreating. They were not reassessing the situation. They were adapting their approach to deal with multiple targets in a complex engagement, and they were doing it with the professional competence of veteran soldiers who had survived this long by never making emotional decisions. Ivan looked at the German medic beside him, at the man's bloodless face and trembling hands, and he felt something break inside himself that doctrine and training had kept carefully contained. This was the moment when abstract principles about duty and orders and acceptable losses became concrete reality measured in human suffering. The German medic was alive because Ivan had moved. The 8 Soviet wounded men were dying because Ivan had moved. Both statements were true simultaneously, and there was no mathematical formula or tactical doctrine that could resolve them into something morally coherent. Ivan had made a choice that followed his conscience, and that choice was killing his comrades. The German medic grabbed Ivan's sleeve with his remaining strength and said something in German that Ivan didn't understand. The man's eyes were desperate and apologetic, and Ivan realized the medic understood exactly what was happening, understood that his rescue had cost Soviet lives, and was trying to communicate something that transcended language and nationality. Perhaps it was an apology. Perhaps it was an acknowledgement of shared humanity in a situation that denied humanity to everyone involved. Ivan would never know for certain because at that moment the SS squad launched their assault on the Soviet wounded, and the sound of concentrated rifle fire mixed with screams that would echo in Ivan's memory for the rest of his life. He had 12 rounds remaining in his rifle, and a decision to make about whether to use them defending the German medic he had just saved or attempting to provide covering fire for the Soviet comrades he had just abandoned. Ivan Petrov made his second impossible decision in less than 30 seconds. He could not save both the German medic and his Soviet comrades, and he knew that any action he took now would be measured against the choice he had already made. The German medic was watching him with eyes that understood death was close, and behind the protection of the stone wall Ivan could hear the distinctive sound pattern of an SS assault. Short bursts of concentrated fire followed by movement, then more fire, the rhythm of soldiers who knew how to suppress targets while advancing under cover. The Soviet wounded were returning fire, but it was weak and scattered, the shooting of men who had limited ammunition and diminishing strength. Ivan counted the shots and recognized voices. That was Yuri firing 3 deliberate rounds from his position, trying to make every bullet count despite his wounded shoulder. That was someone else, probably one of the soldiers Ivan didn't know well, firing a full magazine in panic and accomplishing nothing except revealing his position. The SS would identify that position and eliminate it within seconds, and then they would move to the next target with the same methodical efficiency. Ivan unslung his rifle and positioned it against the top edge of the wall, working by feel and muscle memory, because looking over the wall meant exposing his head to counter-sniper fire. He had 12 rounds, and he needed to decide whether those rounds were worth more protecting one wounded German or attempting to provide covering fire for 8 wounded Soviets across 300 meters of open ground. The tactical calculation was clear. From his current position behind the wall, Ivan had no clear lines of sight to the Soviet positions, and any fire he provided would be suppressive at best. Inaccurate shooting meant to force the SS to take cover rather than actually hitting targets. But from this same position, he could defend the German medic effectively, because anyone approaching the wall would be exposed in open ground with no cover. Captain Sokolov had taught Ivan that in combat you prioritized actions that produced measurable results, and defending a position you could actually hold was better than attempting heroics that accomplished nothing except getting yourself killed. But Ivan wasn't thinking about Doctrine anymore. He was thinking about Dmitri talking about his daughters, and Alexei joking about German radio broadcasts, and Yuri covering his position during that patrol 2 weeks ago, when German infantry had come too close. The German medic grabbed Ivan's arm and said something in rapid, desperate German. Ivan didn't understand the words, but he understood the meaning. The medic was telling him to go, to abandon this position and help his comrades, to not waste any more effort on saving an enemy soldier when his own people were dying. The man's face showed pain and guilt and the terrible knowledge that his survival was costing other men their lives. Ivan looked at him and saw something he hadn't expected. The medic was trying to release Ivan from the moral trap Ivan had created by saving him. He was offering to die alone behind this wall so that Ivan could return to his tactical obligations without guilt. It was an extraordinary gesture from a man who had every reason to cling to the only protection keeping him alive. Ivan shook his head, not in response to the German's words, but in acknowledgement of the impossible situation they were both trapped in. Leaving the medic now wouldn't save the Soviet wounded. The SS had already committed to their assault, and Ivan's rifle fire from an exposed position would accomplish nothing except making him a target. The mathematics were brutal but clear. The Soviet wounded were going to die regardless of what Ivan did next, and the only variable Ivan could control was whether the German medic survived. The sound of gunfire behind them changed. It became more concentrated, more organized, and Ivan recognized what was happening with the sick certainty of someone who had watched this pattern unfold too many times. The SS had identified the Soviet positions and were executing their standard clearing procedure. They would suppress one position with fire while 2 men moved to flanking range. Then they would eliminate that position and move to the next. It took approximately 90 seconds per position when performed correctly, and the SS were performing it correctly. Ivan could hear screaming now, not the screams of men being shot, but the screams of wounded men watching their comrades die and knowing they would be next. One voice cut through the others, and Ivan recognized it immediately. It was Dmitri, the machine gunner from Leningrad, and he was shouting Ivan's name with a rage that transcended pain or fear. He was cursing Ivan with words that mixed Russian profanity with personal betrayal, calling Ivan a traitor and a coward and a fascist sympathizer. Other voices joined him, other wounded men adding their own accusations, and Ivan understood that in their eyes he had committed the ultimate betrayal. He had abandoned his duty, betrayed his comrades, and chosen enemy life over Soviet life. The fact that Ivan had made this choice following his conscience rather than cowardice didn't matter to men who were dying because of that choice. Ivan pressed his forehead against the cold stone of the wall and closed his eyes, but closing his eyes didn't block out the sounds or the knowledge of what was happening. The SS execution squad was working through the Soviet positions with mechanical efficiency, and each burst of concentrated fire meant another man dead or dying. Ivan counted 7 distinct volleys over the next 4 minutes, and then the shooting stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise because it meant the work was complete. 8 Soviet wounded men had been evacuated from their positions, seeking safety in terrain that offered no protection, covered by a sniper who had abandoned them to save an enemy medic. 7 of them were now dead. 1 remained alive, though Ivan wouldn't learn this until much later, when Captain Sokolov read him the charges that would send him to a labor camp for 5 years. The survivor was Alexei, the 19-year-old radio operator, who had been overlooked in the chaos because he had the presence of mind to play dead until the SS squad moved on. Alexei would live long enough to testify at Ivan's court-martial, and his testimony would be brief and devastating. Private Petrov abandoned his position to save an enemy soldier, and 7 of us died because of his choice. The SS execution squad departed after 12 minutes, moving with the same methodical discipline they had demonstrated throughout the engagement. Ivan listened to their boots crunching through snow as they withdrew toward German lines, and he remained motionless behind the stone wall until the sounds faded completely into the wind. The German medic had lost consciousness during the final minutes of shooting, either from blood loss or from the psychological shock of hearing men die because someone had tried to save his life. Ivan checked the man's pulse and found it weak but steady, and he adjusted the tourniquet to ensure the bleeding remained controlled. Then he sat with his back against the wall and stared at nothing while his mind tried to process what had just happened. 7 men were dead. 7 Soviet soldiers who had trusted that their sniper would maintain his position and provide covering fire had been executed because that sniper had broken discipline to save an enemy medic. The mathematics were simple and devastating, and no amount of moral reasoning or appeal to conscience could change them. Captain Sokolov arrived 38 minutes later with a squad of soldiers who had been sent to investigate when the evacuation failed to arrive at the designated rally point. Ivan heard them approaching and didn't move, didn't raise his weapon or call out identification. He simply sat beside the unconscious German medic and waited for whatever came next. Sokolov reached the wall first, took in the scene with one sweeping glance, and his expression didn't change. He was a man who had survived 2 years of this war by maintaining absolute emotional control, and he wasn't going to waste energy on anger or disappointment or moral judgment. He looked at Ivan, looked at the German medic, looked toward the field where 7 Soviet bodies lay cooling in the snow, and then he said 4 words that Ivan would hear in his nightmares for the rest of his life. "You know what you did." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact delivered in the flat tone of someone documenting evidence for a tribunal that would follow with absolute certainty. The soldiers with Sokolov moved past the wall to check the Soviet casualties, and Ivan heard one of them vomit. These were veterans who had seen death in every form the Eastern Front could produce, and the fact that one of them couldn't control his physical response meant the scene was particularly brutal. The SS had not been gentle or quick with their executions. They had taken time to ensure each man was dead, and they had apparently used bayonets when ammunition needed to be conserved. Ivan would never see the bodies himself. Sokolov ensured that Ivan was placed under guard and removed from the area before the casualties were processed, which meant Ivan never had to confront the direct physical evidence of what his choice had produced. But Alexei, the radio operator who survived by playing dead, would describe the scene in precise detail during the court-martial, and his testimony would include facts that Ivan wished he could unhear. Dmitry, the machine gunner from Leningrad who had talked constantly about his daughters, had been shot 7 times. Yuri, the veteran sergeant who had covered Ivan's position 2 weeks earlier, had been bayoneted while trying to surrender. The others had died with varying degrees of suffering, and all of them had died knowing their sniper had abandoned them. Sokolov ordered 2 soldiers to carry the German medic back to Soviet lines, and Ivan understood what this meant. The Germans who had shot 7 wounded Soviet men would be credited with 1 Soviet prisoner when the medic's survival was eventually reported through prisoner exchange channels. The irony was so bitter Ivan couldn't process it. He had saved the German to preserve something human in a war that seemed designed to destroy humanity, and the result was that the SS received intelligence credit and the Soviet command lost 7 trained soldiers, plus whatever tactical advantage Ivan's sniper position had provided. The mathematics, from a purely military perspective, were catastrophically negative. 1 enemy saved, 7 allies killed, 1 tactical position compromised, 1 sniper removed from active duty. It was the kind of loss ratio that destroyed units and got commanders relieved for incompetence. Except this wasn't incompetence. This was conscience operating in a context where conscience was a luxury no one could afford. The march back to Soviet lines took 4 hours through frozen terrain that offered no shelter from the wind. Sokolov placed Ivan in the center of the formation with guards on either side, not because he thought Ivan would attempt escape, but because the other soldiers needed the visible reminder that Ivan was now a prisoner under military authority. No one spoke to Ivan during the march. The men who had served alongside him, who had shared rations and covered his positions and trusted him to cover theirs, now looked at him with expressions that mixed contempt, anger, and something worse, understanding. Some of them knew exactly why Ivan had made his choice, knew the moral reasoning that had led him to prioritize one suffering man over tactical doctrine, and they hated him more because of that understanding. If Ivan had been a coward or a traitor, they could have simply despised him. But Ivan had been following his conscience, trying to preserve something human in an inhuman situation, and that meant every one of them had to confront the question of what they would have done in his position. Most of them, probably all of them, would have followed orders. And now 7 men were dead, and the soldier who had tried to do the right thing was going to prison for 5 years while they continued fighting a war where moral choices led to catastrophe. The court-martial convened 6 days after the incident, and it lasted exactly 4 hours and 17 minutes. Military tribunals on the Eastern Front in 1943 were not designed for nuance or extended deliberation. They existed to maintain discipline in an army that was bleeding soldiers faster than replacements could be trained, and they operated on the principle that swift, visible punishment deterred future violations more effectively than careful consideration of circumstances. Ivan stood before 3 officers he had never met, men whose faces showed the particular exhaustion that came from judging other soldiers, while knowing they might face similar judgment themselves if their own decisions produced the wrong outcomes. The charges were read in formal military language that stripped away all context and reduced Ivan's choice to pure violation of protocol, abandonment of assigned position during combat operations, disobedience of direct orders, and conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. The prosecution presented its case in 11 minutes, summarizing the tactical situation, the explicit orders Ivan had received, and the outcome measured in Soviet casualties. 7 dead, 1 survivor who would carry psychological scars alongside his physical wounds, 1 compromised position, 1 enemy soldier saved at catastrophic cost to Soviet forces. Alexei testified for 8 minutes, and his testimony was delivered in the flat, affectless tone of someone still processing trauma too fresh to fully comprehend. He described the evacuation, the sounds of Ivan breaking position, the realization that their covering fire had disappeared at the exact moment the SS squad attacked. He described playing dead while men around him were executed. And he described the particular quality of Dmitri's screams when the machine gunner understood he had been abandoned by the sniper he had trusted. Alexei didn't embellish. He didn't add editorial commentary or emotional appeals. He simply stated facts in chronological order, and those facts were damning enough without interpretation. The tribunal asked him one question: did Private Petrov's actions directly result in the deaths of his comrades? Alexei answered yes without hesitation, and that was the end of his testimony. He looked at Ivan once during the proceedings, and Ivan saw something in that look that was worse than hatred. He saw pity mixed with incomprehension, the expression of someone trying to understand how a man could choose so badly and still believe he had followed his conscience. Ivan was given the opportunity to present a defense, and he stood before the tribunal trying to articulate something that had no language in military proceedings. He tried to explain that the German medic was unarmed and wounded and protected under international law, and the tribunal interrupted to note that international law had been suspended on the Eastern Front by mutual agreement between Germany and the Soviet Union, which meant Geneva Convention protections did not apply to this theater. Ivan tried to explain that leaving a wounded man to die violated something fundamental about human decency, and the tribunal interrupted again to note that Soviet doctrine explicitly prioritized collective survival over individual conscience, which meant personal feelings about decency were subordinate to tactical necessity. Ivan tried to explain that he had made a choice in the moment, believing he could save one life without costing others, and the tribunal simply read back the casualty reports that proved him catastrophically wrong. Every argument Ivan attempted collapsed under the weight of documented consequences. And after 18 minutes, the senior tribunal officer told him to stop talking because further explanation would not change the mathematical reality of 7 Soviet soldiers dead because of his decision. The verdict was delivered in 2 minutes. Guilty on all charges. The sentence was 5 years of corrective labor in a disciplinary battalion, with all military honors and decorations stripped, and a permanent notation in his service record that would prevent future reinstatement to combat duties. It was not the harshest sentence available. The tribunal could have ordered execution for abandonment during combat, and several officers present had probably voted for exactly that outcome before being overruled by whatever internal politics governed military justice. 5 years meant Ivan would survive, but would never be trusted with responsibility for other men's lives, and the labor battalion assignment meant he would spend those 5 years in conditions that killed approximately 40% of inmates through combination of malnutrition, exposure, and systematic brutality. As the guards prepared to escort Ivan from the tribunal room, Captain Sokolov requested permission to make a statement for the record. The tribunal granted permission, and Sokolov spoke for 90 seconds in the same flat, controlled tone he had used when finding Ivan beside the wall. He said that Private Petrov was an excellent marksman who had served with competence until the moment he allowed individual judgment to override military discipline. He said that the incident demonstrated why Soviet doctrine emphasized collective responsibility over personal conscience, and why that doctrine existed to prevent exactly this type of catastrophic outcome. And then Sokolov said something that Ivan would remember more clearly than anything else from the trial. He said that Ivan Petrov was not a bad man, and that the 7 deaths were not the result of malice or cowardice, but that war had no category for good men who made choices that killed their comrades, which meant Ivan would be punished, as if he were bad regardless of his intentions. The labor battalion was located in the Ural Mountains, 3,000 kilometers east of the front lines, and Ivan arrived there in late February 1943 after a train journey that took 11 days through frozen landscape that seemed designed to drain hope from anyone who witnessed it. The camp held approximately 2,000 prisoners, most of them soldiers convicted of military offenses that ranged from desertion to theft to the same category of insubordination that had destroyed Ivan's military career. They worked 12-hour shifts in timber operations, felling trees in forests where winter temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and summer brought clouds of insects that made sleep impossible. The rations were calculated to provide just enough nutrition to sustain labor capacity without allowing prisoners to build strength or recover from injuries, and the guards were veterans who had been wounded badly enough to disqualify them from frontline service, but not badly enough to warrant discharge. These were men who watched other men suffer with the bitter resentment of soldiers who believed they should be fighting rather than managing a prison workforce. And they took out that resentment through systematic cruelty that stopped just short of reducing labor efficiency. Ivan learned the camp rhythm within his first week. Wake at 4 in the morning to watery porridge and bread that was more sawdust than grain. March 2 kilometers to the logging site regardless of weather. Fell trees using handsaws and axes that were deliberately kept dull to extend the work required per tree. Drag timber to collection points using rope harnesses that cut into shoulders and chests until skin wore away and scar tissue built up. Return to camp after dark for soup that contained more water than vegetables and occasional pieces of meat that might have been horse or might have been something worse. Sleep in barracks designed for 200 men, but holding 300, where body heat was the only defense against cold that seeped through walls and floors. Wake at 4 in the morning and repeat. Men died regularly in the labor battalion, usually from combinations of exhaustion, malnutrition, and minor injuries that became infected, because the camp medical facilities consisted of one orderly with basic supplies and no training beyond field first aid. The dead were buried in unmarked graves in a section of forest that prisoners called the final timber stand, and their deaths were recorded as industrial accidents to avoid raising questions about camp mortality rates. Ivan survived the first year through a combination of physical conditioning from his farm background and psychological detachment that allowed him to treat each day as a discrete unit requiring no connection to past or future. He didn't think about the 7 men who had died because of his choice. He didn't think about the German medic he had saved. He didn't think about Captain Sokolov or the tribunal or the look on Alexei's face during testimony. He thought about which trees could be felled with minimum effort, which guards could be avoided during distribution of rations, which prisoners could be trusted not to steal, and which required constant vigilance. This reduction of existence to immediate tactical problems was the same mental discipline that had made him an effective sniper, and it kept him functional when other prisoners broke down under the psychological weight of indefinite suffering. But at night, in the brief period between exhaustion and sleep, the detachment failed and Ivan's mind returned to that frozen morning when he had chosen to move from his position. He replayed the decision endlessly, examining it from every angle, trying to determine whether some alternative choice existed that might have saved both the German medic and his Soviet comrades. Perhaps if he had shot at the SS squad first, forcing them to take cover, he could have bought enough time for the evacuation to complete before abandoning his position. Perhaps if he had signaled to the German medic to remain still and quiet, the SS might have overlooked him and focused on the Soviet wounded, allowing Ivan to maintain his covering fire while the medic survived through concealment rather than rescue. Perhaps if he had simply followed orders and watched the German die, the 7 Soviet soldiers would have reached safety and Ivan would still be serving as a sniper instead of cutting timber in a prison camp. But every alternative scenario collapsed when Ivan examined it honestly, because the fundamental reality was that the SS squad had been advancing with systematic precision and the Soviet evacuation had been chaotic and exposed, and no amount of tactical cleverness would have changed those conditions. The German medic was going to die unless someone saved him. The Soviet wounded were going to be exposed to SS fire regardless of whether Ivan held his position. The outcome was determined by factors beyond any individual's control, which meant Ivan's choice hadn't actually caused the deaths, so much as selected which deaths to accept and which to prevent. The second year in the labor battalion was harder than the first, because Ivan's body began to fail in ways that discipline and detachment couldn't overcome. His shoulders developed chronic inflammation from the rope harnesses, and every morning he woke to pain that started as a dull ache and progressed to sharp stabbing sensations whenever he lifted weight. His hands, which had once been steady enough to place sniper rounds through targets at 500 meters, now trembled constantly from nerve damage caused by repetitive trauma and exposure to extreme cold. His teeth loosened from vitamin deficiency, and he lost 2 molars that simply fell out during a meal in October 1944. These were the physical manifestations of systematic breakdown that affected every long-term prisoner in the camp. The body's recognition that it was being consumed faster than it could repair itself. Ivan watched other prisoners reach the point where labor capacity dropped below survival threshold, and he watched guards identify those prisoners and transfer them to lighter duties that actually meant reduced rations and accelerated death. The camp operated on brutal mathematics that resembled military logistics, and prisoners who couldn't produce sufficient labor output became resource drains that needed elimination. But Ivan's psychological breakdown was worse than the physical deterioration, and it manifested in a way that surprised him because he had always considered himself someone capable of accepting consequences without self-pity. He began having conversations with the 7 men who had died. Not hallucinations exactly, because Ivan understood these conversations weren't real, but internal dialogues where he argued his case to Dmitri and Yuri and the others whose names he forced himself to remember, because forgetting them felt like additional betrayal. He explained his reasoning to them during the long timber drags when the physical exhaustion created a mental state somewhere between waking and dreaming. He told Dmitri that the German medic was unarmed and protected under laws that were supposed to govern even this savage war. He told Yuri that holding his sniper position wouldn't have saved them because the SS was going to attack regardless of whether Ivan moved. He told Alexei, who had survived to testify, that playing dead was a choice just like Ivan's rescue attempt was a choice, and both choices involved accepting some deaths to prevent others. These conversations provided no comfort and no resolution because the 7 men never responded with forgiveness or understanding. They simply repeated the same accusation in various forms. You chose an enemy over your comrades, and we died because of that choice. In his 3rd year, Ivan learned something that shattered what remained of his psychological defenses. A new prisoner arrived at the camp in spring 1945, a former Soviet intelligence officer who had been convicted of passing classified information to unauthorized personnel and sentenced to 8 years corrective labor. The man was educated and curious, and he sought out prisoners with interesting backgrounds because conversation was one of the few activities that made camp existence bearable. When he learned Ivan had been court-martialed for saving a German medic, he asked questions that Ivan initially refused to answer. But the intelligence officer was persistent, and eventually Ivan described the incident in detail, including the name of the German medic if he had known it, which he hadn't. The intelligence officer listened carefully and then said something that Ivan wished he could unhear. He said that German records captured during the Soviet advance into Eastern Europe indicated that Wehrmacht medical personnel in that sector had been under orders to provide aid to Soviet wounded whenever possible, as part of a propaganda effort to demonstrate civilized conduct and encourage defections. Which meant the German medic Ivan had saved might have been attempting to reach Soviet wounded to render medical assistance when he was injured by shrapnel. Which meant Ivan might have risked everything to save a man who was trying to help Soviet soldiers. Ivan never learned whether this information was accurate or whether the intelligence officer had been speculating based on incomplete records. But the possibility destroyed his remaining certainty about the moral clarity of his choice. If the German medic had been trying to help Soviet wounded, then Ivan's rescue became something more complicated than choosing enemy life over Soviet life. It became a choice to save someone who might have saved others, and the mathematics of that scenario produced no clear answer about right and wrong. 7 men died. 1 medic survived who might have saved Soviet lives if he had reached his intended destination. Ivan's choice might have been catastrophically wrong or might have prevented additional Soviet casualties, and there was no way to determine which interpretation matched reality. The uncertainty was worse than guilt because guilt at least implied clarity about failure, while uncertainty meant Ivan would never know whether his conscience had led him to commit betrayal or prevent greater tragedy. Ivan Petrov was released from the Labor Battalion in January 1948, 5 years to the week after the incident that had destroyed his military career and sent him to the Ural Mountains. He walked out of the camp gates weighing 43 kilograms, less than when he had arrived. With permanent nerve damage in both hands, chronic respiratory problems from years of exposure to extreme cold, and psychological scars that would never heal regardless of how much time passed. The Soviet Union in 1948 was not the same country Ivan had left in 1943. The war was over, victory had been achieved at catastrophic cost, and the nation was rebuilding through the same brutal efficiency that had won the war. There was no interest in examining individual moral choices made during combat, no patience for soldiers who wanted to discuss the complexity of decisions made under impossible pressure. The official narrative was clear. The Soviet people had defeated fascism through collective sacrifice and unwavering discipline, and anyone who had failed to meet those standards bore responsibility for their failures regardless of their intentions. Ivan returned to his village outside Kursk and found it partially destroyed, rebuilt with materials scavenged from the wreckage of war. His father had died in 1944, and the farm had been absorbed into a collective that had no interest in returning land to individuals with prison records. Ivan was given a small room in a communal housing block and assigned work in a factory that produced agricultural equipment, and he spent the next 17 years performing manual labor that his damaged body could barely sustain. He married in 1951, a widow named Svetlana who had lost her first husband at the Battle of Kursk, and who asked no questions about Ivan's past because everyone in their generation carried wounds they preferred not to discuss. They had 2 children, both daughters, and Ivan tried to build a life that resembled normalcy despite the nightmares that woke him 3 or 4 times per week, and the trembling in his hands that made simple tasks difficult. He never spoke about the incident. Not to Svetlana, not to his daughters, not to the other factory workers, who occasionally asked about the permanent notation in his internal passport that identified him as a former prisoner of corrective labor. But in 1962, Ivan received a letter that forced him to confront everything he had tried to bury. The letter came from West Germany, forwarded through official channels by Soviet authorities who had reviewed its contents and determined it contained no security risks. It was written in careful Russian by someone who had clearly used a dictionary and translation assistance, and it was signed by Dr. Klaus Richter, formerly a medical corpsman with the Wehrmacht, currently a physician practicing in Munich. The letter explained that Richter had been wounded outside Stalingrad in January 1943 and had been dragged to safety by a Soviet soldier who had then shielded him from SS fire at tremendous personal risk. Richter explained that he had spent the remainder of the war in a Soviet prisoner camp and had been repatriated in 1949, and that he had spent 13 years trying to identify the Soviet soldier who had saved his life. He explained that Soviet records from that period were incomplete and often contradictory, but that he had eventually learned through prisoner of war testimonies that a Soviet sniper named Petrov had been court-martialed for abandoning his position to rescue a German medic. Richter wanted Ivan to know that he had survived, that he had become a doctor and spent his career providing medical care to refugees and displaced persons, and that he thought about Ivan's sacrifice every day of his life. The letter included a detail that Ivan had forgotten or perhaps never fully processed during the chaos of that frozen morning. Richter explained that when he had been crawling toward the stone wall, he had been attempting to reach 3 Soviet wounded soldiers he had seen from his position, because Wehrmacht medical doctrine required treating all wounded regardless of nationality, when tactical situations permitted. The SS squad had been advancing to execute both German and Soviet wounded, because their interpretation of military necessity included eliminating anyone who might slow their advance or require resources, which meant that if Richter had died before reaching the Soviet wounded, those men would have had no medical assistance and might have died from treatable injuries before evacuation could be completed, which meant Ivan's choice to save Richter might have indirectly saved Soviet lives by preserving the only medical personnel in that sector who would have treated them. Or it might not have. Richter didn't know what happened to the Soviet wounded he had been trying to reach, and Ivan would never know whether the 3 men Richter mentioned were among the 7 who died during the SS assault. Ivan read the letter 17 times over 3 days, and then he burned it in his kitchen stove because keeping it felt dangerous in ways he couldn't articulate. He never responded to Richter, never attempted to establish contact, never sought clarification about the details that might have changed his understanding of what had happened that morning, because the fundamental reality remained unchanged regardless of Richter's intentions or Ivan's motivations. 7 Soviet soldiers had died. 1 German medic had survived. Ivan had made a choice that violated military discipline and tactical necessity, and that choice had produced consequences that destroyed lives and ended his military service, and sent him to 5 years of corrective labor that nearly killed him. Whether his choice had been morally correct or tactically justified or strategically beneficial became irrelevant when measured against the mathematical reality of 7 men dead and 1 man imprisoned for trying to save life in a war designed to destroy it. Ivan Petrov lived another 24 years after receiving Richter's letter, and he died in 1986 without ever resolving the question that had haunted him since that frozen morning in January 1943. The story of Ivan Petrov never became official history. There are no monuments commemorating his choice, no military histories analyzing his decision, no official records that acknowledge the complexity of what happened on that frozen morning outside Stalingrad. The Soviet archives contain only the bare facts: 1 sniper court-martialed for abandonment of position, 7 casualties during evacuation operations, 1 enemy medic captured and later repatriated. The human dimensions of the story, the moral reasoning, the impossible choice, the lifetime of consequences, exist only in scattered testimonies from survivors like Alexei and in the personal correspondence that Klaus Richter attempted to maintain despite Cold War barriers that made such communication difficult and dangerous. When historians write about the Eastern Front, they focus on grand strategy and casualty statistics, and the turning points that determine victory or defeat. They have no framework for discussing soldiers like Ivan Petrov, who made choices that violated military necessity in pursuit of something that transcended tactics. But Ivan Petrov was not unique. The Eastern Front produced thousands of similar stories, moments when individual soldiers confronted impossible choices between doctrine and conscience, between collective survival and individual humanity. Most of these stories were never documented, because the men who made them died before they could testify, or survived and chose silence because speaking would require explaining choices that had no acceptable explanation in official narratives. Soviet military culture after the war had no interest in moral complexity or individual conscience. The approved story was about collective sacrifice and unwavering discipline, about soldiers who followed orders without hesitation because they understood that victory required subordinating individual judgment to systemic necessity. Soldiers like Ivan, who had made choices following their conscience rather than their orders, became inconvenient reminders that war was more complicated than propaganda suggested. They were proof that good men could make decisions that cost lives, that following your moral instincts could produce catastrophic outcomes, and that the line between heroism and betrayal was sometimes determined by consequences rather than intentions. What makes Ivan's story particularly haunting is not that he was punished for trying to save a life, but that he was probably wrong to do it. The mathematics were brutal but clear. 7 Soviet soldiers died because their covering fire disappeared at the moment they needed it most. Those 7 men had families, had futures, had value that military doctrine measured in training investment and combat experience, and continued service to the Soviet war effort. The German medic, by contrast, was an enemy combatant whose survival provided no tactical benefit to Soviet forces, and whose medical skills would presumably be used to treat Wehrmacht soldiers, who would then return to killing Soviet troops. From any rational strategic perspective, Ivan's choice was indefensible. It sacrificed multiple Soviet lives to save one enemy life, and it did so based on individual moral reasoning that prioritized abstract humanitarian principles over concrete military necessity. Captain Sokolov was right. The tribunal was right. The sentence was justified by both military law and tactical logic. And yet something in us resists accepting that conclusion, because it means admitting that conscience can be wrong, that following your moral instincts can make you a monster, and that the most human choice is sometimes the most destructive choice. Ivan Petrov died in 1986 at the age of 67, his body finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of labor camp years and decades of manual work his frame could barely sustain. He was buried in a cemetery outside Kursk, with a simple headstone that recorded his name and dates with no mention of military service or wartime experience. His daughters knew he had fought in the war and spent time in a labor camp, but they never learned the details because Ivan refused to discuss it and Svetlana protected his silence even after his death. Klaus Richter, the German medic Ivan saved, continued practicing medicine until 1989 and died in 1991, and his obituary in a Munich newspaper mentioned his service as a Wehrmacht medic and his post-war work with refugee populations, but made no reference to the Soviet soldier who had risked everything to save his life. The 7 Soviet soldiers who died during the SS assault were buried in a mass grave that was later relocated during post-war reconstruction, and their names appear on a memorial wall in Volgograd that lists 127,000 Soviet soldiers who died during the Battle of Stalingrad and its surrounding operations. Dmitri's daughters grew up never knowing their father, and Yuri's sacrifice was recorded as simple combat death with no notation about the sniper who failed to provide covering fire. The question that followed Ivan Petrov for 43 years is the same question that should follow anyone who hears the story. When military necessity and human conscience collide, when following orders means accepting death you might prevent and following your instincts means risking deaths you should prevent, when the mathematics point one direction and your soul pulls another direction, what do? Ivan chose conscience over orders, and 7 men died because of that choice. Would following orders have saved those men? Probably not, Because the SS squad was operating with systematic precision and the Soviet evacuation was chaotic and exposed. Would abandoning the German medic have been the morally correct choice? According to military doctrine, yes. According to humanitarian principles, no. According to the families of 7 dead Soviet soldiers, absolutely yes. There is no formula that resolves this complexity into clear right and wrong. There is only the choice and the consequences, and the lifetime spent wondering whether you destroyed everything trying to preserve something. At the end, ask yourself, what would you have done? Like if this story shocked you. Subscribe for more impossible odd stories.